Fellow citizens, I presume you all know who I am. I am humble Abraham Lincoln. I have been solicited by many friends to become a candidate for the legislature. My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I'm in favor of the national bank. I'm in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments and political principles. If elected, I will be grateful. If not, it will be all the same. That was my first political speech, which I gave in 1831. And I began stumping for the state legislature. But just about then, Chief Black Hawk and his Indians went out on the warpath. So I joined the volunteers and marched away to war. I was terrified I might have to shoot some poor Indian. Fortunately, the Indians felt the same way, so I didn't see any fighting. It was while I was there that I was elected captain of volunteers, an honor which gave me more pleasure than any I've had since. After serving near 3 months in the Army, I came back home with a great enthusiasm for resuming my political career. I thought my illustrious military campaign would help me win. It didn't. I lost the election. And to make matters worse, the store in which I'd been working as sort of a clerk went out of business, leaving me without the means to keep my body and soul together. I considered the blacksmith trade. I thought about the study of law, but I didn't think I could succeed without a better education. My folks had come from undistinguished families and had migrated from Kentucky to Indiana. It was a wild region. By that time, I was old enough for schooling, except there were no schools. We sometimes had school whenever a schoolmaster would drift into the neighborhood, but school was out whenever he'd drift away. By the time I was 18 years of age and had moved to Illinois, I reckon all of my schooling didn't amount to more than a year. But I had learned to read and write and cipher to the rule of 3, and I read every book I could get my hands on. I was also ready to try my hand at something else besides farming. My old dad had tried to make a decent farm in 5 different places in Kentucky and Indiana and Illinois. It got so we'd moved so many times that I was ready to settle down in one little town. You know, whenever we'd get ready to move, we'd load all our furniture onto the wagon. We'd tie the chickens' legs up and put them on the wagon so they wouldn't run away. Then we'd tie up the horses and the cows to the back of the wagon, and we'd drive off to our next farm. It got so we moved so many times that whenever the chickens would see us loading the furniture on the wagon, they'd lay on their backs and cross their legs. Well, having had some experience at a store as a storekeeper, I thought I'd try my hand in a business of my own. So I borrowed some money, and I went into partnership with William Berry. We opened the Lincoln Berry store over there at New Salem. Well, it wasn't long before that winked out too. What with Berry drinking up all the profits and me reading all the time, little wonder the store didn't fail. But one day while I'd been tending that store, a man drove through town in a wagon. He was migrating to the west, and in the wagon he had all his family and his household plunder. He asked me if I'd buy an old barrel for which he had no use and which contained nothing of special value. He had no room for it in his wagon. I didn't want it, but to oblige him, I bought it and paid him $50 for it. Emptying it out onto the floor to see what it contained, I found at the bottom of the barrel a complete edition of Blackstone's commentaries. The more I read that famous law book, the more intensely interested I became. That book was the beginning of my law studies. Well, Jesse, you seem to have a good case in technical law, and we can without a doubt win it for you. We can also set a whole neighborhood at loggerheads. We can distress a widowed mother and her 6 fatherless children, and we can without a doubt win for you $600, which you seem to have a legal right, but which seems to me to belong as much to the woman and children as it does to you. Now you must remember that some things legally right are not always morally right. No, I couldn't win this case for you. All the time I'd be standing up there in front of that jury, I'd be saying to myself, Abe Lincoln, you're a liar. By golly, I believe I'd forget myself and say it out loud. I will give you a little advice for which I'll charge you nothing though. Now you look like a sprightly, energetic man. I'd advise you to try your hand at making $600 some other way. And now good day, sir. There goes the biggest liar in Springfield. He's like the old fisherman that had quite a reputation for stretching the truth. Bought himself a pair of scales and insisted on weighing each fish he caught before witnesses. One day a doctor borrowed the scales to weigh a newborn baby. The baby weighed 47 pounds. Well, they say I tell too many stories, and I reckon I do. But I have found that most people are more easily influenced through a broad and humorous illustration than in any other way. And what the hypercritical few may think, I don't care. Well, you take like the other day, I was sitting here with my foot up behind the desk like this. Billy Herndon walked in. He said, Abe, I don't believe there's another leg as long as that one in the whole of Sangamon County. Lifting up my other leg, I said, Billy, my guess is you're wrong. I just happen to have another one that's a perfect match. No, I don't suppose there's anything that gets more joshing than my long legs, unless it be my ugly face. Well, you take like the other day, I was out riding the circuit over near Postville. I met a woman riding a horse coming through the woods, and as she rode past, I stopped, let her pass, and I thought I'd pay her a little compliment. She went by and I says, my, you sure do look pretty today. Why, thank you, she said. I'm sorry I can't say the same for you. You could if you told a lie like I did. Well, she got all flustered like an old hen, and she puffed up and she looked at me and she says, I do believe you are the ugliest man I ever saw. Ugly. I said, well, madam, you probably are right, but I can't help it. No, you can't help it, but you might try staying at home more. Well, when I got back to my hotel room, I got into a fit of musing looking in the mirror. And staring into the looking glass, it struck me what an ugly man I really was. It so maddened me that I made an oath that if ever I found the man that was uglier than I was, I'd shoot the poor critter on sight. A few days later, I was back in Springfield. Walking down the street, I spied old Ben Bodensheen. And looking at him closely, I says to myself, now there's the man. Look how ugly he is. So I went back to my room, I took down my gun, and I went out a-hunting him. I prowled around the streets looking for him. He soon come along. Halt, Ben, says I. I'm about to shoot you. Why, Mr. Lincoln, what's the matter? What have I done? Well, sir, I swore an oath that if ever I found the man that was uglier than I was, I'd shoot the poor critter on sight. Now, you're surely uglier, so make ready to die. Old Ben, he steps back and thinks for a minute, and he looks me right in the eye and he says, Abe, go ahead and shoot. If I'm an uglier man than you, I don't want to live. Here's one I heard over to Beardstown. Seems there was a runaway slave that made his way north on the Underground Railway. And he was brought before an official of the Abolitionist Society who asked him, why did you run away? Did your master beat you? No, sir. Massa was kind. Did he starve you? No, sir. I had plenty to eat. Did you have to work too hard? No, sir. I didn't have to work too hard. Well, I don't understand why you ran away from that plantation. Well, sir, I believe my job is still open if you'd like to go back and take it yourself. No, I've never heard of any man who wished to be a slave himself. Whenever I hear of anyone arguing in favor of slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personal. When it comes to freedom, we're not what we have been. When we were the political slaves of King George and we wanted to be free, we called the maxim that all men are created equal a self-evident truth. But now we've become fat and have lost all dread of being slaves ourselves, and we've become so greedy to be masters that we call that same maxim a self-evident lie. I've always hated slavery. I cannot remember when I didn't. Once I was on a riverboat going down the Mississippi from Quincy to Alton, and there was a gentleman on board who had 12 Negroes. He was shipping them down to the slave markets in Vicksburg. And he had them chained together, each with a large iron band around his wrist. And this was connected to a long main chain, so that they were strung together precisely like so many fish on a trout line. I gathered the poor creatures were being separated from their mothers, fathers, wives, children, whatever families they had, to be whipped into perpetual slavery and no questions asked. That's a sight that'll burn in my memory forever. How can anyone say that slavery is not wrong? If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This defines my idea of a democracy. And whatever differs from this to the extent of the difference is no democracy. The repeal of the Missouri Compromise has angered me no end. I'd lost interest in politics for a few years, but I reckon I'm going to take another stab at it. Mr. Chairman, gentlemen of the convention, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now well into the 5th year since a policy has been initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become either all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where it shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates shall push it forward until it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. July 31st, 1858. Honorable Stephen A. Douglas. Sir, yours of yesterday, naming times and places and terms for joint discussions between us, was received this morning. Although by the terms of the arrangements as you propose, you take 3 openings and closes to my 2, I accede, and thus close the arrangements. Your very obedient servant, A. Lincoln. Stephen Douglas has the high distinction, so far as I know, of having never said whether slavery is right or wrong. Everyone else says one thing or the other, but the judge never does. My friends, the Declaration of Independence was thought to include all. But now, to aid in making the bondage of the Negro eternal and complete, it is hawked at and sneered at and torn and construed until if its framers could rise from their graves, they would not at all recognize it. All the powers on earth are combining against the Negro. The god of money is after it. Ambition follows. Philosophy follows. And the theology of the day is fast joining the cry. Certainly the Negro is not our equal in color, perhaps not in many other ways. Still, in the right to put into his mouth the bread that his own hands have earned, he is my equal, the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man, white or black. In pointing out that more has been given you, you are not justified in taking away the little that has been given him. All I ask for the Negro is, if you do not like him, leave him alone. If God gave him but little, that little let him enjoy. Fellow citizens, 32 years ago, Stephen Douglas and I first became acquainted. We were both young then. He a trifle younger than I. Even then, we were both ambitious. I perhaps as much so as he. In the race of ambition, I have been a failure, a flat failure. But with him, the race has been one of splendid success. His name fills the nation, and it is not unknown in foreign lands. Now, there's something that he forgot to tell you, though. Now, Judge Douglas told you that I sold whiskey over the counter. That's true. I worked in a store over at New Salem when I was a younger man, and I did sell whiskey. What he forgot to mention was that while I was on one side of the counter selling the whiskey, he was always on the other side drinking it. The difference between him and me now is I've quit my side of the counter. But let us discard all this quibbling about this man and that man, this race and the other race being inferior and therefore must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and join together as one people until we shall once more rise up declaring that all men are created equal. Fellow citizens, Judge Douglas has accused me of being a two-faced man. I'll leave that up to you, my audience. If I had another face, would I wear this one? It is true that if there were a necessary conflict between the white man and the Negro, I'd be for the white man as much as Judge Douglas. But I say there is no necessary conflict. I say there is room enough for us all to be free. October 19th, 1860. Miss Grace Bedell, Westfield, New York. My dear little miss, your very agreeable letter of the 15th was received this morning. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age. They, with their mother, constitute my whole family. As to wearing whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affectation if I should begin it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln. 2 years ago, during the debates I had with Senator Stephen Douglas, I asked him the question about the power of settlers to decide whether to have slavery or not in the territories. His answer to that question at that time undoubtedly helped elect him to the Senate, as I feared it would, but it most assuredly hurt his chances to be the president now. When I heard that Douglas had beaten me for the Senate race, well, I felt sort of like the boy that stubbed his toe while running to meet his sweetheart. Said he was too badly hurt to laugh and too big to cry. But now I have won the presidency that Douglas wanted so badly. I'd call that victory out of my earlier defeat. All right, Mary, I'll start packing the bags right away. By golly, I'm afraid my wife thinks I'm going to miss my own inauguration. Still 3 months off. Seems like everybody's in a bigger hurry to get to Washington than I am. I'm not looking forward to all that trouble. All right, Mary, will you stop hurrying me? By golly, there's no sure cure for laziness in a man, but having a wife sure will hurry him along some. I must leave you now for a few minutes. I hope you'll be there to see me off at the train station when I leave from Springfield on my way to Washington. So if I may use the words of my distinguished uncle, who had the reputation of being the most polite gentleman in the world. He got this reputation for being polite one day as he was going down the Mississippi River on a steamboat. Well, the boat sank, and as he was thrashing around in the water and going down for the last time, he tipped his hat and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse me." My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feelings of sadness at this parting. To this place and to these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived for a quarter of a century, have grown from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one lies buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I'll return, with a task before me greater than that which fell upon General Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. But with that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me, remain with you, and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you all an affectionate farewell. Well, I always wondered what it would be like to be the President of the United States. Now that I am, I feel kind of like the feller that was tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail. Somebody in the crowd asked him how he liked it. He said, "Well, if it weren't for the honor of the thing, I'd much rather walk." I have been selected to fill an important office for a brief period, and am now invested with a power that will soon pass away. But if my administration should prove to be a very wicked one, or what is more probable, a very foolish one, if you, the people, are but true to yourselves and to the Constitution, there is little harm I can do, thank God. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressor. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. Seems like everybody in the country wants to work for the government nowadays. Leastways, everybody in the city of Washington's lined up outside the White House with applications for office, slipped through half-open doors, thrust these papers into my hands, dog my every step. If they'd leave me alone, I could get work done. I'm like the hotel keeper that was so busy renting out rooms at one end of the hotel, he didn't have time to put the fire out at the other end. Let's tell you a little story I heard about office seekers. Seems there was a certain king that kept a court astrologer to forewarn him of coming events, look into the future, and mostly to tell him whether it was going to rain or not when he went out hunting. One day the king and his hunting party were headed for the woods, and they came upon a farmer riding a donkey. "Good morning, farmer," said the king. "Oh, good morning, your majesty," said the farmer. "Where are you all folks going today?" "Hunting," said the king. "Oh, but your majesty, you're going to get soaking wet if you go hunting today." Well, the king trusted his astrologer's advice, of course, and he kept on to the woods. But just about midday, there came a terrific storm that drenched and soaked everyone. When he got back to the palace, the king had the astrologer beheaded, and he sent for the farmer to take his place. "Oh, shucks, it ain't me," said the farmer, "that knows when it's going to rain. It's my donkey. Whenever it's going to rain, he just lets his ears droop down." "Make the donkey the court astrologer," shouted the king. And it was done. But the king always declared that that was the worst appointment he ever made in his life, because after that, every jackass in the country assembled in front of the palace and wanted an office too. And there's no bigger jackass than Congressman Jeremiah Smith. Now he's everywhere. Go out on the sidewalk. Who's waiting? Congressman Smith. Look out into the waiting room. Who's first in line? Congressman Smith. I can't go anywhere without expecting Smith to pop out of somewhere with an application for office. Oh, it was touching the last time he caught a hold of me. "Mr. President, I'm afraid I'm imposing upon you." "Afraid? If he was so afraid, why didn't he run away? It's not office seekers, it's committees. One committee right after the other wanting to see the president over trivial little things. Well, like the committee of ministers that wanted to know whether the president seeks counsel in the Lord. Of course I seek counsel in the Lord. I pray every night before I retire. I think of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting in this terrible war, the boys in gray as well as the boys in blue. I think of the thousands of widowed mothers and fatherless children, and I pray God give them strength to bear their bereavements. I think of my duties as the President of the United States, and I pray for strength and wisdom. And then I look under the bed, and if I find that Congressman Smith is not there with an application for office, I thank the Lord, I turn out the light, and I go to sleep. Some of our Northerners seem bewildered and dazzled by the news of the war. Some seem to think that the only thing at stake is the preservation of the Union, while others are inclined to believe that this war is to result in the entire abolition of slavery. For my part, I consider this struggle is for the necessity of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have the right to break up the government anytime they choose. If we fail, it will go far toward proving the incapability of the people to govern themselves. Taking the government as we found it, we will see whether the majority can preserve it. Mr. Nicolay, send a dispatch to General McClellan, General George B. McClellan. Sir, I have just read your dispatch on sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you mind me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigues anything? A. Lincoln. McClellan sure has a bad case of the slows. He's an efficient organizer, but all the time he's preparing for battle, he's losing the war. If he doesn't intend to use his army, I sure would like to borrow it for a day or two. Ladies and gentlemen, 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are gathered on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished task which those who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated to the great cause remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Strange that I should be sitting here. I, a man who couldn't even so much as cut a chicken's head off, sitting here with blood running all around me in this terrible war. I've had more questions of life and death to settle than all the men that sat in this chair put together. The soldier's mother has just been to see me, begging for his pardon. He's just a farm boy. Here he is being executed for falling asleep at his post. The boy's action lost nothing for us. Yet if I give out pardons, my generals say I destroyed discipline in the Army. There are too many weeping mothers and fatherless children in this country. For God's sake, why do they ask me to add to that number? I'm not going to add to that number. Maybe I'm doing wrong, but at least I'll make that poor woman happy. Here's a petition for the release of a slave trader from prison for the reason that he is a religious man. Well, I'm glad to hear that. That feller can use all the religion he can get. If this man were guilty of the foulest murder, I might forgive him on such an appeal. They know my weakness for appeals. But a man who could go to Africa, rob her of her children, and sell them into interminable bondage for no other reason than dollars and cents, he's worse than a murderer. He'll rot in jail before he'll have freedom by any act of mine. Religious man. He's like the feller that murdered his mother and father for all their money. Then when he was tried for the crime, he appealed to the court for mercy on the grounds that he was an orphan. They want me to relieve General Grant of his command. They say he is incompetent, a butcher, and a drunkard. I'm aware of only one thing. General Grant is a fighter. Did you know before Grant took command of the Eastern forces, we did not sleep at night? We began to fear that the rebels would capture Washington, and once in command of that foreign governments might acknowledge the Confederacy. But now that Grant has taken command on the Potomac, I've made up my mind that whatever's to be done, Grant will do it. And what he doesn't do, I don't believe is to be done. And now we can sleep at night in Washington. Incompetent. He's winning the war, something we've been trying to do for a while. We had a feller back home in Illinois who ran for sheriff of his county. They said he was incompetent too. A ne'er-do-well who never did anything in his life. Why, he can't even make a decent political speech, they said. But on election day, he got up there in front of the crowd and he said, "Feller citizens, I ain't never made a speech before and I ain't going to make one now, except to say I can whoop any man in the crowd." He was elected. And that's the way I feel about General Grant. He can whoop any man in the crowd. Drunkard. If I ever find out what kind of whiskey he drinks, I'll buy each of my generals a barrel of it. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in right as God gives us to see right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. I better not make that mistake again. A few days ago, I came into the White House in quite a hurry, just like that, and laid my hat in the chair. Later that afternoon, we had some visitors, one of which was a lady of quite wide proportions. She's what you'd call broad in the shoulders. And I guess she was all excited about being in the White House and all, and meeting the president. And she didn't look where she sat. And she sat right there on my hat. Well, I didn't want to embarrass her in any way, so I just remained silent. But the longer she sat there, nested on my hat, the madder I got. And when she got up to leave, I just couldn't help myself. I went over and I got my hat, my poor hat. And I says to her, "Madam, I could have told you it wouldn't have fit you before you tried it on." Do any of you believe in the significance of dreams? 2 nights ago, I retired late. I was quite weary, and I soon fell into a deep sleep. All about me seemed a death-like stillness. Then I heard subdued sobbing, as if a number of people were weeping. I thought I left my bed and went downstairs. All about me seemed a death-like stillness. Everything was familiar to me, but where were the people who were crying as if their hearts would break? I was quite scared, but I was determined to find the cause of it. So I kept on until I arrived at the East Room. In the middle of the room was a casket with a body wrapped in funeral vestments, and all about it were soldiers acting as guards. A great throng of people were gazing upon the corpse, weeping and moaning. I asked one of the soldiers, "Who's dead in the White House?" "President," he said. "He was killed by an assassin." Then a loud burst of grief woke me up from my dream. Well, when this war is over, and that won't be very long, I tell my son Tad we can go back home to Springfield, Illinois. That's where I was always happiest as a youngin', sitting around the stove cracking jokes, telling stories, riding the old 8th Circuit, practicing law. I tell Tad I'll buy him a horse and a cart, and he can have a garden out and back all of his own if he wants. Someday, by golly, I hope it's soon, I'm going to be taking that long train ride back to Springfield, Illinois. Taking that long train ride back. I'd like to sink out of sight and be forgot, although I suppose I will be remembered for some of the marks I've made towards civil liberty. But I'd much rather have it said of me that I plucked a thistle and planted a flower where I thought a flower would grow.